Thanks, Ken. All right, well, thank you very much for that generous introduction. And it sounds like the microphone's working. Everybody in the back row can hear. Terrific. All right. And I'm going to start to wander a little bit because I'm one of these instructors who prefers wandering rather than just sitting and standing up here with you folks. So you're going to see me start taking off, which they tell me means that the folks in the other room I'm going to black out at certain points, but I'm still here. All right. But it is a real pleasure to be here. It's actually my first time to Pensacola. So I've been to the Gulf Coast a number of times, but this is just a lovely town. And you have a terrific institution here. Now, Ken's told me that, and so I'm absolutely convinced that you have a terrific institution. But we've been talking about it for an hour and a half or 2 hours. And boy, it's a real vision. And I think that you're going to hear that the kinds of things that they're doing here mesh very well with what's going on in terms of some of the things we're thinking about as far as the biological sciences is concerned right now. The other thing I should tell you is that it's true, I've come from Washington, but I left the checkbook home, right? So I didn't, Ken's out of luck. I'm sorry, you're all out of luck. So let's get started thinking about the biological sciences now at the start of the 21st century, all right? And I want to anchor us with this National Research Council report, which was in 1989. And the distinctive thing that they called for in this report in 1989 was this notion of pulling together what were the sort of single discipline endeavors and pull them in a way that you bridge cell biology to physiology, you bridge physiology to ecology. So they wrote this report. It was 350 pages. They said that in the introduction, and they very quickly went into all the silos. They, in fact, didn't go ahead and talk about the real bridging that was needed. The next step, then, is what's called the Bio 2010 report. Once again, this had to do a lot with education now, in terms of how do we train our students? How should our students be educated? I'm going to come back to this point later on as well. Once again, this emphasis on interdisciplinary thinking, which is exactly what goes on in this institute here. They really focus a lot on interdisciplinary thinking, and I'm going to come back to that theme multiple times. When I got to Washington in 2005, began to look at the biological sciences, one of the great things you get a chance to do in this position is sort of really step back and say, what's going on in biology? What can I do in terms of bringing some leadership to the life sciences? And the biological sciences is traditionally seen as an area that is not necessarily strong in terms of conceptual and theoretical issues. It is, but it's not often seen that way. It's often seen as a really deep collection of facts. And I don't know about your experience, but the experience of many people when they go into biology classes is it just seems like a lot of memorization. I'm going to memorize this. Here are the amino acids. Here's what the genes are. And we just go on and on and on. And that's not really biology. If you're going to do biology research, it is much more engaging and much more interesting than that. It's much more like what goes on in the physical sciences on a day-to-day basis. So I was able to just go to the National Research Council, National Academy of Sciences, and say, I'm thinking about this. Could we get a committee together? And they agreed and produced this report on the role of theory in 21st century biology. So we now have that in place in terms of laying out what the conceptual framework looks like in the biological sciences. And that got us part of the way, but we went back to the NRC again and said, can you pull up what some of the really grand challenge questions look like in the biological sciences? And we're doing this now in partnership, National Science Foundation, National Institutes of Health, and the Department of Energy. The three of us are together now supporting this report. There's a committee working on it, and they'll have that out in October, they tell me. Big questions, the grand challenge questions in the biological sciences. Origin of life, for example, things like that. So with that bit of a background, what I want to do with you this evening is say a little bit about the history of the biological sciences, just a touch, just to get us anchored. And then I'm going to walk into three different areas. Some ideas about life in transition, things that are going on right now in biology that we see at the National Science Foundation as really leading edge research areas, really cutting edge research areas. But in order to get at some of these scientific questions, we're going to talk some this evening about how the sciences themselves are changing. And this building here and these researchers that you have here in Pensacola are really very nice examples, it seems to me, of what this is all about. And we'll get to that. And then, if these two things are going on, it means that you have to manage your institutions differently than has traditionally been the case. And again, this institution is a manifestation, both physically and also the way in which it's managed, how you can address some of these leading edge questions in the life sciences. So when we think about biology then, and especially the emergence of the biological sciences in the 1800s, there was no biology as such in the 1800s. If you're alive in the 1800s and a scientist interested in the life sciences, you were a natural historian. You could do that. Charles Darwin started off as a natural historian, sailing across the world. You could be a physiologist. You could do that. You could be a geologist. And geologists of a certain sort, by late in the 1800s, were doing actually ecology. So ecology grows out of the geological sciences. But late in the 1800s, there's a collection of biologists. Darwin was certainly one of them. But more importantly was Thomas Huxley, Darwin's bulldog, the individual who argued very strongly in favor of Darwin's ideas. These individuals began to think about the biological sciences in the sense of a more unified discipline. So they saw the natural natural history as one way to sort of get at the study of life. They saw physiology as another way to get at the study of life. But there seemed to be something common here in terms of the interests of these individuals. And it was Huxley who began to argue for this science called biology. And he brought it actually with a very strong conceptual and theoretical basis in terms of what is life? Where does life come from? What is the meaning of life? How did it emerge on this planet? Big questions that Huxley was interested in. But virtually at the same time, there's another scientist, Jacques Lerbe, who's working, and he says, I'm not sure about this theory stuff. I'm not sure you really need it. And in fact, I just want to understand kind of how I can get things to work when it comes to living systems. Furthermore, I think if you reduce living systems to their parts, you can make much more progress on understanding how these systems work. And so there's a word that you may have heard of in the sciences in general and in biology in particular called reductionism. It's the notion of taking us, for example, reducing ourselves to our organs, reducing ourselves then to our cells, reducing ourselves then to our genes, reducing our genes to our proteins, reducing our genes to parts of what those genes are in terms of sequences. It's called a reductionist research strategy. And it's a way in which you sort of learn how the whole works, potentially, by studying the parts. But at some point, I'm going to argue, you really want to pull the parts together. And you want to understand how the system works. So we think about ecosystems, and we think ourselves also as systems. Now, Lerbe argued also for this sort of engineering ideal. How do you manipulate the cells in a way that you can actually get them to do things for you? Early foray into biotechnology. And in fact, it was Lerbe who was the initial one to stimulate cells to reproduce, to begin to multiply parthenogenetically. It was Lerbe who did that at the turn of the century. So we have these two sort of approaches, one strongly theoretical and conceptual, and Lerbe saying, I want to be an engineer. I just want to understand how these things work. We go forward a couple of more decades into the 1900s. The biological sciences are emerging. And we see, starting in the early part of the century, a really strong push towards application. And Abraham Flexner, in 1910, was the lead individual on what's called the Flexner Report. And the reason that this country and Canada has the exceptional medical system that we do right now stems from the Flexner Report. Flexner looked at medical training that was going on and said, this isn't very good. And his colleagues argued we need much better medical training, and we need medical training that's strongly oriented towards research. So research went into the medical schools starting about this time. And we see these kinds of things develop then. Antiseptics, vaccination, antibiotics. Throughout the century then later on, we see pesticides. It's not connected with this report. But it's this notion of controlling life. So through the 20th century, we see a very strong focus on the whole idea of controlling living systems, especially with respect to human health. Now, I've laid that out as a dichotomy, but it doesn't have to be a dichotomy where you have theoretical issues on one side and conceptual issues, and then you have application on the other side. Again, this is a great institute here where these individuals have to understand the basic issues, the basic science that goes along with how things work, and then how do you apply that. Now, in a policy document, Don Stokes, who was at the Brookings Institute at the time, the late Don Stokes, argued for this kind of schema. He called it Pasteur's quadrant. And he called it Pasteur's quadrant because when Pasteur was approached with the problem of the fact that the wine was spoiling, the wine was turning to vinegar, he had to step back and ask what was driving it to vinegar. And it turned out, in order to understand what was driving the wine to vinegar, he had to invent the whole area of microbiology. So this basic question, why the wine is spoiling, led Pasteur backwards to the discovery of microbes and everything that went along with microbes, and then the application of microbiology within the whole wine industry and understand what happens. So use-inspired basic research sort of goes over here. You can have pure basic research like Niels Bohr, who just said, I want to understand what the atom is. I want to understand the parts of the atom. I want to understand this as a physical entity, but I'm never going to apply it. I don't care if it ever gets applied. Pure basic research. But from that, you can build things like nuclear power plants once you understand the basics. There's also exploration and description. Any of you who are bird watchers know Peterson's field guides. Description of the birds of an area. You can have mammals, you can have butterflies. Simple exploration and description, and you can have pure applied research. Edison was not interested in theory. Bohr was uninterested in application. Edison was uninterested in theory. He could care. He just wanted to keep trying things. And one time when asked why it took him 2,000 tries to invent the light bulb, he said, it took me 1,999 times to discover how not to invent the light bulb. Then he got it right. So both these pure and use-inspired basic research are consistent with what happens at your National Science Foundation in Washington, D.C. It's a great institution that you all support. We all support. I actually pay taxes too. I did that a couple of weeks ago, I remember. It's a great institution that we all support that's focused on basic research as well as use-inspired research. But it really is, as a paragon, the basic research institution in our federal hierarchy of all the research institutions that we support. Basic research is really the paragon as far as NSF is concerned. Again, Pasteur's quadrant, as a schema, you can walk across this whole spectrum here. In fact, here's a great example of how you can walk across that spectrum in thinking about the biological sciences and this notion of understanding life and then controlling life. So here is a discovery where the researchers were interested in purple petunias. We were just talking about petunias over here. Purple petunias, and wanted purple petunias. Began to breed purple petunias and got white petunias. So what was that all about? And the individual was clever enough to actually ask, what was that all about? And what was happening? And in the course of understanding why he wasn't getting purple petunias from his purple petunias, he discovered this whole area called RNA interference. So we have genes, and our genes make proteins. They make proteins by virtue of this thing called RNA, ribonucleic acid. What he discovered was that there were ways in which RNA could be interfered with. So when the gene said, make this protein, there was another messenger that came in and said, sorry, we're not going to make that protein today. We're going to knock it out. It's called RNA interference. That protein then gets knocked out. And we think that that evolved actually as a way for organisms to control bacterial infections. When the bacterium got in or a virus got in and said, do this, cell, the cell responded by producing these RNAis. That's the context in which it evolved. But take that understanding now and apply it, RNAi, RNA interference, and we can now produce resistance in papaya, for example, engineer a virus. These are the papaya plants in which the RNAi is functioning. So you knock out the virus as the virus begins to express itself using this RNAi. And here's an even more interesting application right now. Therapeutic RNAi. You take some of these RNAis and inject it right into the eyeball of an individual. And you can take macular degeneration and shut it off and even begin to reverse it. So these are trials now that are happening. So just imagine, you have gene, you want a protein down here, you need the RNA in here, make the protein that says, put this coding down. Not going to happen. You knock out, short circuit it as a result of the RNAi. And in fact, there's some evidence it might even be reversible. 2006 Nobel Prize went to Fyron Mello for this discovery, for putting this connection together. But at the end of the day, if the Nobel Prize Committee were really up to speed, they would have given it to the folks who worked on petunias. Because it all starts with the petunias, right? You need people who need to think, who are interested in thinking about the petunias. We need those basic scientists who are at the end of the day sort of just worrying about how does this stuff work? Where does the understanding? But you can go then to improve the quality of life. Biology then, if there are only 4 things you need to know about biology. We're all made of cells. We have DNA and RNA. We evolved, and all life is interconnected. Cells, genes, ecology, and evolution. The 4 great conceptual pillars for the biological sciences. If you remember that, when you go home, that's it. You got it. You can be biologists. Remember those 4 things, and you can be biologists. 4 great theoretical constructs. And as we think then about the arc of biology in the 21st century, starting out at that transition with the emergence of the biological sciences, what is life? There's a group of individuals interested in understanding living systems across scales of time as well as space. So we're interested in the history of life, and we're interested in the diversity of life across the many ecosystems, whether it's the coastal ecosystem you all live in here, or it's the kind of northeastern deciduous forest ecosystem I live in Washington, D.C., or it's the saguaro Palo Verde forest ecosystem that I live in when I go to Arizona. And also, 21st century biology is increasingly dealing with the consequences of human technological achievements. And I'm going to get to that in a little bit when we talk about global climate change. So this arc of biology then is sort of this back and forth between understanding, application, and it's what happens here in terms of this particular institute. So you have a great example of that here in this Pensacola community. So that's some thoughts on sort of the background for the biological sciences against which we're working now in Washington, D.C., and thinking about where is biology going from here. And I want to make the argument that we really are at a moment where life is in transition in a number of different ways. And the biological sciences in particular, I'll make the case to you, is at a point where the physical sciences were at the transition between the 19th and 20th centuries, when great scientists like Einstein and Niels Bohr produced the theoretical constructions that moved the physical sciences from a collection of just facts to the theoretical bases, to the applications of everything we've seen in the physical sciences through the 20th century. Transistors, radiation, all that emerges once you have the basic concepts in theory, and then you can begin to apply it. And that's what's going on in biological sciences right now. We are right at that tipping point between the movement from a largely descriptive discipline to one that will be driven in a way that will be able to make much more robust predictions than we can right now. Our vision at the National Science Foundation within biology is to inspire research and education at the frontiers of the life sciences. So we really want to be supporting investigators who are living absolutely at the edge. When I talk to my graduate students, I say, I want you to do a dissertation. Imagine a table. The dissertation's not on the table. It is just barely off the table. I want you to stretch with your fingertips and just barely be able to get that. I'm not going to let them fall off, but they just have to barely be able to reach where it is so that we actually build a new piece of the table by virtue of what they're discovering. And that's the life in which I want these scientists to live. Now, when we think about life in transition right now, I want to pull out three big areas for you. One has to do with the origin of life. The other has to do with sort of basic energy systems. And then the whole concept, the notion of adaptation in terms of how our ecosystems are changing. So when we think about this planet, this distinctive oasis in the universe, it emerges as an anoxic world. Okay? So it's a world of rocks and fumes, noxious chemicals, and somewhere in that mix of chemistry, I'll get to in a second, life begins to emerge, and we get this process called photosynthesis. Photosynthesis really begins to change the dynamics of the planet because it puts oxygen into the atmosphere. We become an oxygen-rich planet. Life emerges then onto the land in this kind of landscape here, and we are now this O2-rich world. And in a very real sense, then, life put Earth under new management. Once you got life on this planet, things really begin to change, and we are a fundamentally different planet than the rest of us, the rest of the planets in the universe, at least up to now. We'll see what will happen from here in terms of discoveries on Mars, for example. But just to put a fine point on this notion of life putting Earth under new management, Bob Hazen and his research team at the Carnegie Institution published a paper a few weeks ago. Bob's a mineralogist, but he likes to think about biology, so he comes over and talks about biological sciences. But they published a paper a few weeks ago. There are 4,500 minerals on this planet. 4,500 minerals, if you think about iron, you think about carbonates and so on. Of those 4,500 minerals on this planet, 3,000 of them are derived from living organisms, living systems. 3,000 of them. 2/3 of the minerals on this planet come from the living organisms that evolved on this planet. There's no better example of that than Florida, which is perched on these carbonate shelves that were built by corals. So it's a mineral system built completely by living organisms. And Hazen and his group now have shown us the degree to which life is just this dominant thing when it comes to this planet. If you want to model Mars, you just have to know the geosphere and the atmosphere. If you want to model Earth, you have to worry about the biosphere. It's this geosphere, biosphere, atmosphere, complex set of interactions, which is what is making it so hard to do the climate change models. But let's think a little bit about origins then. So we start with the basic elements here in terms of this planet. It's undergoing all kinds of bombardments. They are open systems as far as the chemistry is concerned. And then we begin to see the emergence of this self-sustaining biochemistry. And there's a real question now in terms of whether RNA, ribonucleic acids, were first, or was the DNA first? RNA first, RNA world, DNA world, which came first? How did this biological complexity emerge from this prebiotic chemistry? It's a place where there are a number of investigators now working really hard to understand what that early chemistry could have possibly looked like. How do you go from something down here to this self-contained cell, an energy system that's running against the basic physics? How do you get self-replication and then ultimately the evolution of biodiversity, all these organisms that are on the planet right now? Is there more than one way to get to life? At the moment, we think there's one way, but it's an open question. Where did genome stability come from? And are there rules for membrane assembly? Is there a minimum set of genes? What's the minimum number of genes you can get away with and still have a living organism? It's an important question for those who are interested in a field called synthetic biology. So you have systems biology, and there's this notion then of being able to create and manipulate living cells for all kinds of purposes. And that synthetic biology is going to depend upon having answers to these kinds of questions here, answers that are being thought about by someone like Eric Smith at the Santa Fe Institute, who sort of argues that as this chemistry proceeded early in life, billions of years ago, it got to a point where life sort of inevitably emerged from the chemistry that was going on as a stable state, the early living organisms. Energy then is a basic part. It's the reason that you're all sitting here in the room. It's the reason I can speak to you and walk around up here. We're these energy-driven systems. And we're going to hear a lot about energy. We're all going to hear a lot about energy from Washington, D.C. for the immediate future. And a really striking issue in front of us is how can we take, once again, back to understanding, these natural energy systems. These organisms have been at this energy business for billions of years. And you're able to sit there and listen to me and think with this astonishing computer in your head. I have one in my head as well that works on really, really low energy systems. Much, much better than any computer. How can we possibly mimic that? How can an institution like this, for example, in Pensacola, come up with a computer that's as good as what's going on in one of our heads right now? And likewise, when it comes to basic energy systems like photosynthesis and the application of photosynthesis, here's the work of Barry Bruce at the University of Tennessee, who was able to reach into a spinach plant, basic problem, reach into the spinach plant, pull out the photosynthetic apparatus. It's called photosynthetic apparatus 1. He put a little bit of gold on one side, a little bit of silver on the other, shined some light on that, and he got a current across it. Now, what I want to do is get Bruce to scale that up and put it on the roof of my house or your house. Then you're really in business, right? To be able to do that. And it's this notion then of being able to take these basic systems and scale them up. It's a real problem. It's a major engineering problem. It's the kind of thing that people, again, here wrestle with. Or you reach into the oceans, as Ed DeLong did, to begin to understand the basic energy systems in microbes. And how can we take that then and ensure a future of renewable energy at a time when we're wrestling with all those kinds of problems? So I predict that in the next couple of weeks you're going to hear from President Obama some real interesting ideas and some thoughts about an energy initiative. Now, these new energy systems then can come from lots of different places. And microbes are a real important source of potential new ways of thinking about energy. Microbes for fuel cells, microbes for algal production of hydrocarbons, for example. Investigators are reaching into places like Octopus Spring. Any of you who have ever been to Yellowstone National Park might recognize this. And they're pulling out microbes that are living at these astonishingly high temperatures and doing incredible things, living on arsenates and iron and manganese and nitrates and selenium and sulfate and something called uranyl oxide, right? And these microbes are living on these things. How do we understand them well enough that you can then take that and apply it to batteries, to make better batteries than we have now? So we have origins, we have energy systems that we want to understand a lot more about, and then at the end of the day, there's also this whole notion of adaptation. We are adapted organisms to our environment, but our environment is changing rapidly. Now, our environment on this planet has changed for billions of years. We're in a very rapid period of change now, but it has indeed changed for billions of years, starting with the early stromatolites. We've been hit by meteors throughout the eons. Extinction, ironically, is a fact of life. So if you look at the biology on this planet, some 99% of the species that have ever been on this planet are extinct. They're gone. 99%. We're 1% of the remnants as far as this planet is concerned. And now we're in this notion of adapting and surviving as the world around us is changing dramatically. So what can we learn from the basic stories of adaptation as scientists in a way that will help us understand planetary change, in a way that we can then take this living world, understand it, make predictions about where it's going in the future? And indeed, it's changing really rapidly. The ecosystems around us are being dissected, as you can see here in this Amazonian forest picture. We have introduced species. You know kudzu well. Kudzu's winning in this case here. The cryosphere is disappearing. It's certainly changing. The Intergovernmental Planet on Climate Change predictions were that the Arctic Ocean would be open by sometime around 2050 in terms of being able to sail across it. 2050, right? But in fact, the data are tracking faster, and it could be as early as somewhere around 2020 that Arctic Ocean would be open. This is a time now, remember, I can remember being 8 years old and hearing on the radio, coming home from the beach, this amazing thing that happened. The Nautilus submarine, some of you will remember, did what? It sailed under the polar ice cap, right? That was the only way to get there, through water. The Nautilus went under it. We're now in a position where my grandchildren, who are 3, twins, 3, will be able to go on a high school field trip sailing across that Arctic Ocean. That's where we've come to at this point. Now, this is an ecosystem that has been closed for millions of years. It's been closed, and it's going to be open. It's going to go through changes, all kinds of changes, both biologically as well as economically, as we, in a more general sense, insert ourselves into these wildlands. These changes are all in front of us, and they're in front of us because we are the dominant organism on this planet, and we're producing lots and lots of carbon. And this is the Keeling curve that shows the change in carbon from 1950, CO2 in the atmosphere from 1950 up into the 1990s. So it's tracking straight up. And as a result of this, the cryosphere is shrinking. But one thing that happens when you get less and less white, you get more and more dark. And this changes what's called the albedo of the system. Heat is absorbed more, we know this, just sort of in dark things as opposed to light things. It's not reflected. And also this other gas called methane is being given off. And methane is a worse CO2, is a worse greenhouse gas than CO2. So you get this positive feedback loop where you're losing the cryosphere, you begin to get darker, you put methane up, it gets warmer still, and it just the whole thing keeps going like that. And we have to figure out ways to short circuit that. We have to do both adaptation as well as mitigation. When it comes to climate change, we have to understand these living systems across these scales of time and space. There are models now that indicate by 2050, again, my grandkids, remember I'm worried about the grandkids now. The kids don't worry about anymore, much to their chagrin. I don't worry about them anymore. It's the grandkids. So on the basis of these mid-range predictions, somewhere between 15 and 37% of the species on the planet will be gone by 2050. It's an immense extinction rate that we're looking at as we go forward here. So ironically, once again, we're the first generation of scientists with the tools to understand the dimensions of biodiversity and to take advantage of bio-inspired discoveries. And we may be the last with the opportunity to discover what's going on as these species go extinct in front of us. We're in this immense period of change right now. We really are in transition. And as the science is changing, as the questions are changing, the basic questions are changing, the way in which scientists want to study those questions are changing. And that's what's happening again at this institute here. So I've talked about the possible role of theory. We want to pull that up as biologists. But the other thing that's happening in biology, as many, many other sciences, is that it's undergoing this really deep cultural transition relative to the way in which the work is done. So traditionally, we think about these disciplines. You think about biology, and you think about chemistry, and you can think about mathematics or geology. But now more than ever, investigators want to work together in teams, these multidisciplinary teams where they pull these groups together. Then they can do these interdisciplinary collaborations. And from these interdisciplinary collaborations, you can actually get these brand new, we'll call them disciplines. So again, you can take chemistry, you can take biology, you can take mathematics, and you can make biochemistry up here. Now biochemistry becomes a new silo in this model down here. You take biochemistry, you put it together with engineering, put it together with computer and information sciences, and eventually you get synthetic biology. So these disciplines now are tracking and they're merging, and we want to be able to create our institutions in order to take advantage of the way in which this scholarship is changing as far as the academy is concerned. So how do we do that? Well, we do that at the National Science Foundation by engaging our scientific communities. So on your behalf, we invite people to Washington, D.C., or we go out and we meet with them, and we have them do reports. And we have them sketch ideas like this National Plant Genome Initiative. So the National Plant Genome Initiative is a 5-year plan to go from the basic understanding of the genetics of plants on to better yields, better production. When I talked to farmers in Iowa, one woman in particular, I remember talking to her and I said, can you grow the same crops that your grandparents did? She said, we can grow the same crops, but I can't use the same seed. Same seed won't grow in Iowa now. We have to use different kinds of seed because of climate change, because of the way in which the soils are changing. And by being able to map from genetics out to the way in which the organism, the phenotype, is expressing itself in those farms, we can help them out. The tree of life is another way in which we're trying to understand the deep phylogeny, the origins of living organisms on this planet. This is one of, I think, 2 figures out of The Origin of Species. This is Darwin's idea of how organisms could be hooked together in what we'll call a phylogeny. But we now know, as a result of the work of Carl Woese, that things are considerably more complex. And Woese actually described the origin of this whole new group called the archaea. It was a group that was thought to be sort of bacteria, but there's really this ancient group now that was buried in the bacteria that he pulled out. And Woese argued that there might be this last universal common ancestor, or LUCA. The notion of being able to track the tree of life all the way back down to this really, really deep ancestor. Could you do that? Turns out it's going to be pretty difficult. And it may indeed be the wrong question. And it may be the wrong question because bacteria, we now know, transfer genes among each other. And they do it profligately. It's called lateral gene transfer or horizontal gene transfer. So when you get to the base of the tree of life, it is this mixture of organisms that are swapping these genes back and forth. So what gets to count as a species in bacteria is going to be very different than what gets to count as a species when you get up to things that look like us. Or you get to things that look like, as we were talking about a moment ago, crepe myrtle. Perfectly good species, they're bisexual. Bacteria are not like that. They're transferring their genes back and forth, which is part of what makes it so hard to keep up with antibiotics as well. They evolve really quickly as a result of that. We bring the community in to talk about those kinds of things, and they do workshops for us, and they produce reports. Where to go next, and help us understand where to invest your tax dollars on research projects to begin to understand how we can take these things and go from understanding to discovery. As we look at the life sciences in transition as well, we need to be able to connect across scales of analysis. Back to the microbes, these evolving genomes, and this whole new science of metagenomics, it's called, where you can actually reach into buckets of seawater and now sequence the genes that are in that seawater. The sequences are getting fast enough and it's getting cheap enough that you can just run out these gene sequences now. And now the trick is, how do we move it up into physiology, the next step? And how do we take these organisms then, collect them together in a way that we can understand these changing ecosystems that are changing right in front of our eyes. But as we think about the transition also as far as life is concerned, one of the clear things that happen is the evolution of complexity. This hydra has a nervous system of sorts for sensing the environment, but this marine worm, the nervous system is more complicated. And this salamander gets even more complex, very complex as far as salamanders and behavior are concerned. We need to understand the evolution of this complexity and then be able to pull it apart in a way that eventually you can potentially apply it. So, in closing this loop between theory, observation, and experiment, traditionally in looking at something like complexity, the argument was you could have an animal model, it might be a small mammal, for example, and then the scientist would build a mathematical model and then a computational model. But now the argument is, and this is what's happening here, Kudashek and colleagues have argued, build a physical model. See if you can build a physical model. See if you can build a robot that will mimic the behavior. And I'll bet if you build a robot, you can learn even a little bit more about the biology. You go from the behavior to the neural properties of these organisms, and then back to the robotic system. So here's an example of how that might work. A classic problem has to do with the origin of terrestrial organisms. Where did they evolve? Now, when I was a graduate student, if I wanted an answer to that question, I went and talked to a paleontologist. And that paleontologist could walk me through strata, could walk me through fossils. Someone like Jennifer Clack could lay out fossils from Greenland and say, here are the transitions. This is a question now that's becoming of interest to neuroscientists. So when you ask, how did organisms get out on the land? The other question is, how did they manage to walk out on land? How did those early organisms get up and get going into those sorts of systems? Johannes Perret in Switzerland asked that question with his research team, and he said, I bet we can learn something about it if we build a robot. So here's the wiring diagram for his robot. He decided to build a salamander. This is a salamander. Doesn't look like the one that we had just before, but this is his salamander, the Perret research group. And they said, I bet we can learn something from this robot. So they did. They build their robot and they go off to Lake Lucerne. And if my graphics work, their robot performs like a fish, right? That's what a fish looks like, swimming through water, wiggling back and forth. And then when it gets to land, their fish begins to walk. All right? So they built this robot to do this. Now the nice thing about this robot, or what it told them, was that they could build this robot with a wiring diagram, wiggled, gets to land, walks. They didn't have to rewire it. They just had to change the amount of energy going through the wiring system in order to flip this robot from doing one thing to the other. That gave them an entree then to go back to the living organisms, the salamanders, and say, what did the energy look like going through those organisms? And then they can tweak things a little bit more, get a little bit better robot. This is going on now. It's going on here at this institute, some of it. And they're also doing invertebrate robots. So this is a vertebrate robot in the sense of a salamander, right? But imagine a robot that is like a marine worm, where it can be collapsed. You can let it walk into a space and then cause it to expand, do what you want it to do, deflate, and come back out. Now, I know when I used to change the spark plugs in my Toyota, I would have loved to have something like that. So that when I twisted and hit my knuckles, remember, to be able to do something like that. So this robotics is really a fascinating new area at the interface of the life and physical sciences and engineering, where people are exploring how you can get bio-inspired discoveries to apply to all these different sorts of instances. Now, if we're going to do that, if we as a society, if we as a nation are going to be able to do those kinds of things and deal with those sorts of scientific questions, then we have to keep thinking about our kids. We have to prepare this next generation of students in order to be able to deal with these wonderful sorts of questions in these brand new sorts of ways. So this summer we'll be doing for undergraduates this big Vision and Change conference, this sort of ask in a generation where students are tweeting and they're going to websites and they're doing YouTube. Is it really best for me to stand up and do a 50-minute lecture with them? How can I? You folks are very patient. You've done this before. The kids of today, though, trust me, I teach 400 undergrads, are much less patient when it comes to that sort of thing. So the question for us as educators is to sort of understand how we can take the informal learning systems, because our kids, my kids and our grandchildren, know a lot about social networks, they know about informal education, and how do we translate that, move that to the formal sorts of mechanisms, formal scholarship that we need in order to make progress on these sorts of questions. That's the thing we have to do with our kids. We have to be able to use their way of thinking and learning in order to teach them brand new kinds of things. It also means that as science administrators, someone like myself needs to think about what's the best way to be organizing these disciplines. How can we support the scientific communities best who want to do that? So if you come to NSF, you'll find that we have these 6 major sorts of disciplinary areas. That's the way in which we're organized. And we have education and human resources. As Dr. Ford indicated, we've got these 7 major directorates. Actually, I have 6 of them here. We didn't worry about education in this one. 6 of the research directorates. And we're organized like a layer cake at NSF. So we have the floor for biology, we have the floor for physics, we have the floor for geosciences. And all the interesting communication happens in the elevators. We need to be able to do better than that. You need to be able to design your spaces. And we also need to be able to think intellectually about how do we get these things together. So what we're trying to do now actually is generate lots more intersections here. And in this, what one of my program officers sarcastically called the flying saucer model as far as organizing NSF, we need to be able to bridge these boundaries back and forth across these disciplines much, much better and much faster than we have been up to now. So NSF is organized. We're in the executive branch. Those of you who didn't know that, our director reports directly to the president, and then the assistant directors sit here. Although the last time I looked, the line of presidential succession does not run through biology, but nonetheless, we're sort of on the org chart as far as the White House is concerned. We're doing things like not just biology, not just chemistry, but there's chemical biology now at the National Science Foundation, and we're hiring program officers jointly appointed between these different directorates in order to foster these things. And the other thing that we're doing is we're thinking about experiments in innovation. We're thinking about how you think about the process of discovery. How do you think about how you discover things? And we're trying to explore this idea of one biology. That's one way to think about it. And we have things called Dear Colleague letters. So Washington lives in acronyms. That's an acronym for a Dear Colleague letter, where we get an idea and we say to the community of researchers, what are you thinking about in terms of origin, energy, adaptation? Tell us, send us some proposals in those areas. But we're also doing things like taking program officers from biology and geology, and we're putting them together on a single floor, so we're getting them out of the layer cake. We took 17 of them, we're putting them in one area of the building, we're giving them tens of millions of dollars, and we're saying, find the very best ideas that you can in biogeochemistry, in multi-scale modeling. The other thing we're doing is we're looking for these novel solutions. So at NSF, what we do is we ask the community for ideas, and they send us proposals. We pull together other members of the community, and we review those proposals. Traditional, it works. It's given the United States a phenomenally successful science program. Alan Leshner, who'll be here in a month, will tell you that. But we need to think of some other ways, what in the business world they would call disruptive technologies when it comes to the process of discovery. So what we just got through with is something that's called the sandpit process. It's called a sandpit because it emerged from the United Kingdom. If it were here, it would be called a sandbox. So you can begin to get the idea. It's the notion of all these kids in the sandbox, and you want to see what comes out of it. Now, how does it work? We put up a problem in synthetic biology, and we asked the community to write to that problem. Just 2 pages. We only wanted 2 pages. So they gave us their ideas. We got 170 of them. 170 people wrote and said. But the other thing they had to do was to fill out a 2-page questionnaire prepared by an industrial psychologist. And it had questions on it like, how well do you play in groups, for example? Back to the sandbox with the kids. We had a review team look at all 170 of those applications, and they identified 30 individuals. Kind of play in groups well, have really interesting ideas. We brought them to Washington, D.C., and we locked them in a building for a week. Just locked them away outside the city with a review team. And these folks wrote proposals for that week on the fly with the review team right there, getting instantaneous feedback. Sounds like a good idea? Great. Dr. Ford, you're a terrific theoretician. Wait a minute. What are you going to do? How are you really going to get this to work? Go see Collins over here because he's more of an empiricist. And oh, by the way, if you're working in synthetic biology, you need an ethicist. You need an ethicist. You really need to think about the societal implications of what you're doing. Go find Professor Magnuson over in the corner because she's a great ethicist. And we could create these teams then, and that's what happened. So this sandpit process is another way in which we're doing it. We're looking at the business community, things like crowdsourcing, to use computers and cyber infrastructure to bring individuals together from across the world. We're exploring all these different models right now. We're putting people together to look at the coupling between natural and human systems. So we're putting together the biological sciences, the geosciences, the social, behavioral, and economic sciences, and even with other agencies, the U.S. Forest Service. The Plant Genome Program is a great example of the way in which your government works to pull together USDA, National Science Foundation, National Institutes of Health, Department of Energy, in this multidisciplinary program to study plants. The ecology of infectious diseases we do between biology, geosciences, social sciences, and the National Institutes of Health. We get together with them to understand, for example, something like Lyme disease. The fascinating thing about Lyme disease is that the greater the species diversity in the small mammal community, chipmunks, mice, the greater the species diversity of the small mammal community, the lower the burden of Lyme disease in human communities. The lower the burden of Lyme disease. And that's because we're a dead-end host for Lyme disease. It would much rather be in these small mammals. So when you have a rich species diversity of small mammals, Lyme disease is much less. But that's the part of the biodiversity of the community you lose when you start to transform communities into urban landscapes. And that's what happens in parts of New England. Interdisciplinary training for undergraduates, then, our biologists have to become much, much better mathematicians than they are right now. And so we're doing work with education and human resources, math and physical sciences, and the biological sciences to pull these investigators together and then the students together to become much better mathematicians than they are now. We're developing new tools. I mentioned metagenomics, and that's because we are a microbial world. You all think you're individuals sitting out there, but there are tens of thousands more microbes in you than there are cells in our bodies. We are much more microbes. We're microbes. I'm a great microbe right now, giving you a talk. The other thing we have to look at is across these scales of space as well as time. So we're developing these cyber-enabled observatories. These are hybrid systems that can collect data in real time, 24/7, and also can serve as decision support tools for policymakers. Help someone in Pensacola, the Pensacola government, make decisions about ecological systems. And so we're about ready to start funding the National Ecological Observatory Network. And this is a network that will be spread across the United States, Alaska, Hawaii, Puerto Rico, to hook together analyses all the way from surface level measurements out to planes and then on to satellites, to begin to make predictions about the way in which our ecosystems are connected and influencing each other across the entirety of the United States. NEON is part of a series of these observatories that will be coming online. There's one that will be funded this year out of appropriations for the northwest part of the United States in the oceans. And these observatories are being built up worldwide in order to give us these new horizons as far as Earth observation is concerned. 24/7, you will be able to plug in with your computer into these data sets and see streaming down how temperature is changing, how various levels of nutrients are changing, what the biodiversity looks like in different parts, and how that's changing over time. You'll have access to all these data, as will the teachers in these communities, so they can actually walk their kids through how these ecosystems are changing. So we really are at a point, just begin to wrap up now, we need to understand better this intersection between the atmosphere, geosphere, and biosphere. We're interested in managing the life sciences which are in transition, but the science is changing, the kinds of questions that want to be asked are changing, the way in which scientists are doing their science is changing, and therefore the way in which we manage our institutions has to change, and the kinds of institutions we create. This is a distinctive kind of institution where you're sitting right now in terms of fostering the kinds of ideals that we're talking about now as far as biology. And integrating therefore across these vast areas of scholarship, it's not easy. You can talk to folks here and I'm sure they will tell you it's really, really hard. You have to learn a brand new vocabulary when you're talking to someone in another discipline. And that takes time, it takes patience, it takes a lot of energy. So just to begin to wrap up then, when we think about the sciences and we think about scientific research programs, you think about sort of a lone scientist working in his or her laboratory. But more and more now, what we have to think about is sort of not just this lone scientist, but sort of making his or her mark with respect to any particular sort of discipline. But we have to think about how we can pull these scientists together. How can we get them together in teams to think about research problems, to think about problems in molecular biology, and how it fits together with issues in ecology, how that goes together with physiology to eventually come to the kinds of applications we'd like to do. We've taken our biology apart, and now we want to put that biology together again in a way that you can begin to see a much larger picture as far as what the science is all concerned. And we think we can do that by understanding the history of the science, the fact that there are these major questions now, especially in terms of origins, energy, and adaptation. Take that in terms of where the scientists want to go, the way in which they're doing their science, and come out the other end in terms of how we manage our institutions for the very best way in terms of the scientific community, but also for you folks as citizens. And so that's what we do at the National Science Foundation. Thanks very much. Microphone. So we have some time for some questions when we start in the front.
With what you know about climate change and extinction of species and whatever, do you feel it's really necessary that we go to extraordinary extremes to save the whales, polar bears, and whatever, or should we basically just let them fade out through natural course of events?
Because you're really going to start with the tough questions right away, aren't you? Whoa. So I'm of the opinion we need to hold on to them. And so the question is, in these systems, we just don't understand well enough how they work right now. So that's one very clear kind of argument as far as why you want to hold on to them. There are also a variety of arguments that have to do with aesthetics. There are arguments that have to do with the kinds of products that we can get from these organisms. Nonetheless, your point is exceptionally well taken in the following sense. If, in fact, some of these projections come true, and we do indeed lose 15 to 37% of the species, rough estimate, there are about 10 million species on the planet that we can see. 10 million that we can see. We're ignoring the microbes at the moment. So if you're going to lose 10%, you're losing 1 million species. So if you make the decision to keep them, then we have to decide as a society, where do we keep them? And how do we hold on to them? And what do we need to be doing? So I have a book coming out actually in June, I'll plug it. It's called Extinction in Our Times. And Tom Lovejoy, who runs the Heinz Institute, wrote the foreword for it. And he makes the case there that every species should be treated like a work of art. A Van Gogh, a Bierstadt, a Picasso, and we want to hold on to them. But that would be an immense societal commitment to do that. So you've asked a great question. You could write a book on that question. I wrote a chapter on that question.
How do you translate your concepts and your goals, which you've well stated, and I agree with entirely, into action? How do you do this integrated biology and mathematics study at the undergraduate level?
Yes.
How do you influence that? I know that you control a lot of money through your grants. Do you give preference to grants that show interdisciplinary approaches?
Yes, we can do that. We can do that.
How do you...
Well,
what's the practical aspect of converting these thoughts into the training that goes on at universities and colleges?
Yeah, no, this is a tough group. You all have really good questions so far. The way in which you translate, so money's helpful, but we also have to remember that even at a budget of, well, the whole NSF is $7 billion. That is way less than 1% of the national budget when it comes to education. So the best we can do is be a bully pulpit. But we can fund model systems. So as you suggest, we can begin to put some money into places where instructors are willing to really reach and stretch and to do these sorts of interdisciplinary programs and to pull the mathematics in. We can pull together, like we're going to do this summer, deans and provosts and presidents of universities and say, look, this is where it's going. And if you're still teaching introductory biology the way it's been taught, it's just old. You really can't do it that way. You're not going to bring the kids into the science that way, and we know that. And so they have to change. So you can put these kinds of pressures on them. You can ask them to change culturally, but we have to be willing to reward our faculty members too, who want to do this. You have to have a reward, just like in business, you need a reward structure to do that. I think he has a follow-up.
I do. Is there some way that you have of following up to see what your progress is. What I'm interested in is, this is great. I really like it. And I'd like to see this brought about. But I also have experience with universities, and there's a lot of resistance to change.
There is.
A lot.
There is.
So do you have some way of measuring your progress and how you're
We
proceeding with
do.
this?
We can. They have to file reports, and we have meetings and we have workshops, so we can follow the progress that way. But you're absolutely right. I mean, some of you will understand the image of turning an aircraft carrier. It takes a long time to turn an aircraft carrier. Some of you will understand the notion of changing the military. It takes a long time to change these sorts of organizations. And you put your finger right on it. Universities are sometimes our own worst enemy. And again, we come back to this notion of the whole process of discovery. How do you do that? This institution here was spun off from a university, which gives them a certain freedom and a flexibility. Their challenge, our challenge as a National Science Foundation, any institution's challenge, is to keep from hardening in the system in which you have become very good. And we need to look no further than the automobile industry in the United States for a system that hardened in place in a way that just was resistant to change. It's a real challenge for institutions to keep evolving, to keep changing themselves. And it's called, in the business community, the innovator's dilemma. And the toughest institutions to change are the institutions that are the most successful. And again, you can look to the automobile industry. Very, very successful, very, very successful, very successful, and all of a sudden falls off the edge. And there are many examples like this, whether some of you will remember the computer disks that were this big, remember? And then they got this big. And then they got 5 1/4 inches. Now it's in my pocket here, right? And before long, it'll be cloud computing. You won't even have it. You just uplink to the servers that are somewhere here in the greater Pensacola area. That's where we're going.
We have time for 2 more questions.
2 more questions. You need the mic so the folks in the other room can hear.
Simple question. How do you popularize these new concepts, the integration between different sciences,
right,
to the common man, to the common Joe and common Jane?
Right.
I observed in the time that I've been living here, I'm a ex-petroleum geologist.
Yes.
And I tried to bring the science and popular discussions, and there's an absolute resistance. Mm-hmm. So you come with much more advanced concepts
right
here. How is our population able to faintly understand it and support it?
Right. We're going to go back to this gentleman's question over here. It has to do with how do we get these ideas into our schools. It's going to require a great deal more respect when it comes to the importance of science, the importance of being able to think in certain kinds of ways. I'll come back to this notion of how you think about particular problems. And we learn how to think about problems when we read our literatures, when we study our histories, when we think about our religions. And science is another way of thinking about the world. And our students have to come to appreciate that there is this way of thinking about our natural world in a rational way. And we have to get that embedded into the classrooms. Now, for the first time in a while, we have an administration in Washington that is placing great value on science. We have a number of people now. Stephen Chu is an exceptionally good scientist, Nobel Prize winner, who's head of energy, DOE. My colleague Jane Lubchenco, who's head of NOAA, is a first-rate scientist, National Academy of Sciences. John Holdren, who's head of the Office of Science and Technology Policy, again, a member of the National Academy. These are really first-rate scientists. And the trick is going to be how well can we get that converted into policies that can then cascade through the larger society, a society that can be receptive to these kinds of ideas, not accepting, but open to debate and open to wanting to discuss them. And that's really the trick. We got either way. Where do you want to go? We have question here, question here. What do you want to do? We want to do one more?
Sure, we can do 2 more.
2 more.
Yep. Concise questions.
I have two short. One, I have two daughters who graduated recently from college, and at the graduation, it was kind of depressing. They said, okay, the Department of the graduates in history, majors in history stand, and there were twice the room full here.
Right.
Then they said, okay, the graduates in physics, stand there, about 3 of them. And in the same
I'm surprised there were 40. Really?
And so that seems kind of a little bit depressing in terms of the future of science to me, and I wanted to get your thoughts about that. And then the second one is very simple. Public TV, they had a program about about fusion as a source of energy, nuclear fusion, and just like you to comment on that.
Yeah, well, I'm not a physicist, and we're not going near cold fusion, I'll tell you that. So I don't know how far we are in terms of the future as far as fusion is concerned. The whole notion of science, though, it's your statistics, I'm sure. I'm surprised there were 40 physicists.
No, 4.
Oh, 4. That sounds right. 4 sounds right. I thought you said 40. I thought, whoa, where are you at? MIT? 4 sounds right. Yeah, no, the students just do not go into those disciplines right now. And it comes back again, how do we get these ideas into society? But I'm going to be willing to accept some of the burden, right? I mean, I have to teach the science in a way that gets the kids engaged. I'm back to this point about Twitters. I don't Twitter, but I sort of heard of it. YouTube, yes, I've heard of YouTube. And we Skype with the grandkids, right? So we do these kinds of things. So the trick is, how do we get the kids engaged in these kinds of things and using science as well? Okay, we have one more question, I think. We're going to hear about crepe myrtle, I think, up here.
No. I was just going through the internet the other day, and they had a map of how many people graduate from high school in all the states of the Union.
Right.
And it appeared to me that about 30% of the population never graduates from high school. Florida was not in the top, not in the bottom, but in the middle. About 37% don't graduate from high school. Those are the ones that we're losing to the system, and if we can't somehow change their way of thinking, the rest of it is going to have a hard time going forward.
It's true. You're absolutely right. In my home state of Arizona, I think that number is closer to 45%. It's not a good number. It's not a good number at all as far as the United States is concerned. And that's a much, much larger societal issue that's in front of us, especially as we look towards a world that is increasingly a knowledge-based economy. That's a world that depends upon innovation, depends upon creativity. And where are those kids going to come from? Where are those employees going to come from as we look to the future? I mean, they're really great issues. They're really great questions. Really.
Thank you. Let's thank our speaker.
You're welcome. Okay.